Hi everyone, I'm Dale Smith, aka Journo Dale, and we're here to talk about Canadian politics. It's time again to take some viewer questions, and this week we are going to start with Kyle, who is on the Patreon and asks, given the prorogation in the UK this week, could you tell people about under what circumstances the Governor-General could legitimately refuse to the request of a Prime Minister? As we know, the Governor-General, like the Queen, always acts on the advice of her Prime Minister. And we do, however, grant them enough discretionary power to say no in very limited circumstances. With the prorogation like the one that happened this week in the UK, there wasn't a lot of really compelling reasons why the Queen would say no in that case. Partially because the prorogation period wasn't going to go over the Brexit deadline, and it would still allow for when a prorogation happens in the UK, they have what they call a washing up period, which just kind of lets them clear the decks before the prorogation actually starts, which is unlike how it works in Canada. So there's still that period by which they can try and move some business in the UK around Brexit, as well as we said, the period for which the prorogation is happening is fairly short, and afterward there is the Queen's speech, which we would refer to as the speech from the throne in Canada, and that also allows for a confidence vote to happen in both parliaments as well. So that's kind of the context in mind. So what kind of a situation would the Queen or the Governor-General refuse a request from a Prime Minister? That generally tends to be something in the order of an unconstitutional request, or something in a situation such as where the Prime Minister has lost confidence and is trying to use a prorogation instead of dissolution or having to resign and turn over to a new government. Those are the only kind of situations I can think of offhand, because we have to remember that the Queen and the Governor-General are fire extinguishers and not referees. So it would need to be something that is blatantly illegitimate or unconstitutional for them to refuse a request. And that's not necessarily around prorogation. It could be around something like appointments. There is precedent in Canadian history where a Prime Minister had lost an election and was trying to push through a bunch of Senate appointments before he turned over power, and the Governor-General at the time said, no, you lost the election, I can't grant this request for you anymore. So those are really the only particular kinds of circumstances where that would likely happen. Because again, we have to remember the discretion is very limited, and it's only in terms of, when something is absolutely blatant. And our next question is from Patricia, who asks, the NDP is slow in getting candidates out, but what's with the Liberals? This is a very good question. So the backstory here is that the NDP in particular, and also the Liberals, have had a lot of trouble in filling all their nomination candidates, and we don't know if it's trouble or if it's shenanigans, and that's kind of where this goes down to. With the NDP, I think there's a certain amount of disorganization in their party headquarters. They've had a terrible time in terms of organization and fundraising and finances and so on for the last couple of years. So that's probably contributing to their lack of organization when it comes to getting their nominations done. At last count, they hadn't done any nominations in New Brunswick, for example, which is pretty unusual, but also pretty alarming, actually, as to kind of a state of what the party is in right now. The Liberals, on the other hand, are not disorganized, and the fact that they did not have all of their nominations sorted and at the 70-day mark or whatever it was, decided to declare a national election urgency or something like that in order to basically suspend party rules around nominations so that they can have a more direct hand in making those appointments or making the nominations, which could include appointment, I think is what the issue is more likely to be here. There has been talk that they're trying to get star candidates in certain ridings, and that's why they've delayed nominations. For example, there was recently one MP in Montreal for whom her nomination was delayed, and she was supposedly had all the boxes ticked in order to have a protected nomination, and then the party basically said nope, and the riding association is left scratching their heads and wondering what's going on. And now there's talk about the Liberals possibly putting a star candidate in that, or a star candidate, as we should always qualify it, in that riding instead. So I suspect it's a lot more to do with shenanigans. The things we need to remember here is parties have gotten very bad at the basics of nominations in the last number of election cycles. Samara Canada just recently had a report out about basically the appalling state at which nominations are happening in various parties across the country, and that a very small percentage of them were actually properly run contested nominations and not ones where the party was either appointing or where they did not have a challenger for whatever the reason. And that's pretty troubling because that's a fairly fundamental aspect of how our system's supposed to work. It's where the grassroots empowerment is supposed to happen. It's where the people in the riding are supposed to get a say in who's on the ballot for them. And if the party is manipulating that, then that's a fundamental, not just problem, but it's almost like a rot in what is happening in our system. And I think it's something that we ordinary Canadians need to pay a lot more attention to and to speak out about, because that is the party leaders and their party leaders' offices and their operatives overreaching what their role is within our system. And it's robbing the grassroots of their power and their agency. And that's a fundamental problem in our system. And we should be paying attention to this and calling it out. And I think that's what we might have to do again in this case, particularly with this Montreal MP. Our last question's from Twitter, where Stevie Nicks, as they call themselves, asks, once again, it's more of a plea. Can you fact check the campaigns similar to the way Daniel Dale does in the States? Again, that's a question of resources and time. Nobody is paying me to fact check, unfortunately. So I do little bits where I can. But then the question goes on and says, the mainstream media print outlets in Canada are declared conservative and there's not enough real journalists on TV and it's more chat shows. And I thought with this, I might just try and explain that a little bit and demystify that for people. So when we hear that media outlets are declared conservative, we need to remember that that's the editorial boards typically and not the reporters. And there is a separation between the two, and if an editorial board recommends or endorses conservatives, for example, that doesn't mean that they're telling their reporters that you must, make the conservatives look good and the liberals look bad. That's generally not how these things work. I know there's some concern right now about the kind of direction that Postmedia is going in around that. I think it's still too soon to say what the effects of that are going to be. But for the most part, we need to just remember that editorial board endorsements and reporting are separate things. The other thing that was mentioned in there was the TV show, the political shows on TV and the kind of panels that happen there. The thing that we need to remember with that is it can be very difficult to fill an hour or 2 hours of TV 5 days a week with political news. And so what's tended to happen is that producers have decided on this formula of getting talking heads for each of the parties to come in and talk about, the news of the day. And they do it in these kind of, as though they're party strategists or so on. And they're trying to tease out conversations about what strategy is, what tactics are, what's good, what's not good for parties. But at the same time, we have to remember that these are people speaking essentially on behalf of parties. They may not necessarily be on the phone with the party headquarters and getting talking points from them, although some of them are. But it's kind of the sense that, these are people who have experience in politics with this particular party or brand, and therefore they're going to try and demystify that for people. The problem with this is that it's not necessarily good TV. It sounds good in theory, but when it happens, it's kind of run of the mill, and it's, talking heads who spout talking points that their parties or their putative parties are putting out. And that's not necessarily furthering the conversation. Sometimes there's good insight there, occasionally, but not always. And we've also gone through eras where we had certain hosts who would like to rile them up so that it was shouting matches because they felt that that was good TV, as opposed to having, reasonable discussions between parties. The thing, it's fairly easy programming in that regard. So you've got your block or two of this discussion in the show every day. You've got a regular group of panelists who are there. So it kind of takes the weight off of the producer's shoulders in terms of trying to fill that airtime. And that's kind of how that came into being and why we're kind of stuck with it. Unless we get far more resourced shows, and unless we have a political culture where we've got more openness from not only parties and party operatives, but also just in terms of experts who can get the time to come on and have these discussions, we're kind of stuck with the format that we have. It's not necessarily the greatest, but that's kind of the limitations around it and why it's evolved the way it has. We don't necessarily need to like it, but that's kind of why it is. And when we can realize that and demystify that a little bit, hopefully that can make us a little more critical in our thinking and in our viewing. And this doesn't mean that I don't yell at the TV when I watch these particular shows and certain panelists come on and lie to the public, because I certainly do, and sometimes I yell at the TV over Twitter, as some of you who follow me know. But it's and I have to have sympathy for the hosts as well, because sometimes they don't know exactly what's going on, or in terms of what the panelist is talking about, because they may not understand the nuances of that issue, or they may feel a certain amount of trepidation in pushing back because they get accused of, if not bullying, then favoritism or partisanship, and then we get into more problems around where these shows are at. So it's an imperfect system, and that's kind of what we're stuck with, unfortunately. And that's everything for this week. Join us again next week for some more Canadian politics. I'm Dale Smith, that's at journo_Dale on Twitter. And don't forget to like the video, share, subscribe, and support us on Patreon. Thanks, everyone.